Right. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. We're zooming in from various parts of Metro Atlanta, and we're happy to be here today presenting as part of DLF 2020. I'm Christine Wiseman. I am the head of digital services at the Atlanta University Robert W. Woodruff Library. Presenting with me today are two of my colleagues who will introduce themselves now.
Hi, I'm Sarah Tanner, and I am the head of the Archives Research Center at the AUC Woodruff Library.
Hello, everyone. I'm Josh Hogan. I am the Assistant Department Head of the Digital Services Department at AUC Woodruff Library.
Great. Our presentation today is called Managing in a Crisis, and it will focus on three areas impacted by the recent events in our rapidly changing world: managing remote digital projects, responsive archival collecting, and documenting current events. Next slide. Located in the historic west side of Atlanta, the Atlanta University Center, Robert W. Woodruff Library supports the teaching, learning, and research missions of 4 institutions of higher learning that comprise the world's largest consortium of historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs. Like all institutions in higher ed, our library faced a quickly changing landscape with the advent of COVID-19 in March of 2020. In addition, the killings of George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks, and Breonna Taylor by police and the resulting protests for racial justice highlighted the need to collect more digital materials related to these events. While the library was already exploring ways to improve digital and archival workflows and be more responsive and time-sensitive in archival collecting efforts, the pandemic, coupled with the racial justice protests, served as catalysts to hasten these efforts. Next. I'm going to begin by describing our digital program and how we continued services after moving to a remote work scenario. Responding to the pandemic required a quick and agile pivot from managing an on-site digitization program and 3 different grant projects to staff working remotely while continuing to provide digital services and support. Our department is responsible for on-site digitization, management of our institutional repositories, digital scholarship support and library publishing, grant management, and digital preservation. Our program plays a role in the entire life cycle of digital content, from curation through digitization, description, access, and preservation. Next. Like many institutions, back in March, we had just a few stress-filled weeks to plan to move library staff to remote working. HBCUs are already used to having limited resources, requiring creativity and flexibility. However, this situation was a stretch for us. Also, we are in the unique situation of serving 4 institutions, all facing different challenges. Luckily, they all came together with a united plan in the end, but it took some time for that to be worked out and implemented. According to a recent survey by the Chronicle of Higher Education, the most common form of opening for the fall semester among HBCUs was some type of hybrid model. The second most common plan was virtual only for the semester. And in their survey, 23 HBCUs went virtual for this fall semester, which is about 23% of all HBCUs. And in comparison, only 10% of colleges overall throughout the country are virtual only this semester. And in July, our schools decided to go fully virtual for the fall semester. So our focus in digital services during this initial planning period before we went remote was really looking at our documentation, on cross-training, succession planning, creating work plans, and securing equipment that we needed to go remote. Regarding documentation, we wanted to ensure that we had up-to-date comprehensive documentation in a location where all team members could access it remotely. This had been a priority for the past year or so in our department, So we had some pretty good documentation in place. We just needed to tighten it up and fill in gaps. A few years ago, we started using Microsoft OneNote, which you see a screenshot here. This is a tool for collaborative note-taking as part of the Office suite. You create notebooks with subpages. The entire notebook is searchable and it tracks who adds content and the date. And it's really become a very useful tool for group editing. And you can see this is the metadata section of our plan, of our documentation. We also had, as a manager, I had to create a number of different remote work plans for different scenarios. We had to do individual plans, departmental plans, both on a weekly and a monthly basis. Our initial plan was for a month of working from home, and that was 8 months ago. So since then, we've had to expand and revise these plans. Then in July, we thought we were returning to the building for the fall semester, and we started to plan for delivering in-person services. But then when the schools went back and decided to go fully virtual, we had to then revise our plans. So the library closed to visitors, but we do have essential staff in the building, so that required a new set of work plans. So flexibility. Next slide. Another critical activity that went on was succession planning. This is very important in case a department member is out for any extended period of time. So to document this activity, I created a spreadsheet, and along the left-hand column was all of the key job responsibilities for all the department members, grouped by category, not by who does the job. And the categories were like personnel management, repository management, digital preservation, metadata, analytics, etc. And then across the top are the actual positions in the department. Each responsibility is coded, whether it's based on the frequency, whether it's something we do on a daily basis, or maybe quarterly, or once a year. And then I wanted to make sure that every urgent and intermediate task had at least a primary person responsible and at least one backup. And then from that exercise, we were able to figure out where we had gaps in cross-training. And then finally, we had to secure the equipment and access needed for remote work. We had to make sure everybody had a functioning laptop, access to our OneNote notebook, access to VPN, access to the servers they needed for the images to do their remote work, and all of our various cloud-based remote servers for ingested content to our IR. Next. Once this was all in place, we were able to work really actually very efficiently and effectively. Productivity was quite high, even though staff faced an initial adjustment, as they got used to working from home. It's not as comfortable. Internet's not as reliable. You don't have all your monitors at home, etc. But generally, I think things went really well. This slide shows a little collage we put together of people sent in images of their workspaces and their pets, which is a fun way to document the changes. So during remote work, we focused on priorities, including more documentation and reporting. So it was a good opportunity to do operating procedures for the whole department. I worked on updating the library disaster plan. And then we worked on a lot of cleanup projects, and we still are. So our metadata is in great shape now. We've done all sorts of cleanup of our digital files, our metadata. We ingested a lot of legacy content into our repository. We've been working on audio and video transcriptions. And we just completed a project, the whole department worked on it, where we were working on optimizing our discoverability of our digital collections in Google. So we had to submit a new site map to Google, where we mapped a bunch of over 2,000 URLs. Everybody in the department participated in this, and it was really a nice way to to manage a team project, even though we're all working virtually. And the whole initiative only took a couple of weeks, and it would have been months if we had to do it just one person. We also took advantage of this time for staff training and staff development. It's an opportunity for staff to take an array of free online webinars and attend virtual conferences. Many of us were able to attend meetings we wouldn't otherwise have been able to attend in person, even international conferences. Next. So some work did have to cease temporarily, in particular on-site digitization, which can present obstacles in completing grants. Thankfully, grant agencies have been flexible with extensions. We're in the midst of 3 significant grant projects when the pandemic started. 2 were close to wrapping up and 1 was just getting started. We were fortunate that the CLEAR Digitizing Hidden Collections grant was wrapping up, and the remaining tasks were primarily metadata, ingest of collections, and reporting. And all of that continued remotely without delay. The other project, our LYRASIS-funded GAMS project, was basically a fully online project already, so that also continued without interruption. Our DPLA Black Women's Suffrage project was supposed to start in the spring, and that's a digitization grant, so we did have to request an extension. We received the extension, and the project, now that staff are in the building, in a limited fashion, the project is underway, and we're on track to complete that within our new timeline. We did have to change the workflow just a little bit to accommodate staffing changes, and we're meeting more frequently, but otherwise it's going very smoothly. Next slide. So far, and this is an ongoing experiment, I feel like we've had good success in this new, the new remote world. And I think some of the keys to our department's success have been around communication, collaboration, and accountability. We've upped our meetings. We have 2 meetings per week. One Monday morning check-in, kind of a chit-chat type meeting, informal, and then a Friday meeting where we wrap up the week and report out on activities. And in some ways, we communicate more now as a department than when we were in the building spread out among 3 floors of the library. We also have used a lot of collaboration tools, some new ones, some tools we used before, including Teams, certainly Zoom, Google Docs, OneNote, and that really helps to foster a team environment. And accountability, you know, as a manager, I've had to do a lot more reporting. I think that's to be assumed, but it's been a way for us to communicate our accomplishments to our administration, since we don't see them in person either. So even though it's tedious, I think it's been important. We do weekly reports, weekly analytics reports, monthly reports, and quarterly reports. So in addition to the general shift to managing digital projects remotely, the library also had to consider that the events that affect our communities are happening quickly and oftentimes in an ephemeral manner. In order to collect and preserve a more complete version of the history of the HBCU campuses, the AUC Woodruff Library Archives Research Center is developing responsive collection development initiatives, which my colleague Sarah Tanner is going to discuss in more detail.
All right, thank you, Christine. As Christine mentioned, the way in which we manage projects has necessarily changed. What we focus on and prioritize has changed, and hopefully that flexibility has allowed us as information professionals to be responsive as we face these new challenges. In addition to a shift in project management, we've also taken this opportunity to expand an area that we were already beginning to focus on, and in a lot of ways focus on the profession as a whole, but became even more important in the time of COVID, and that is a more responsive collection development plan. I wanted to talk briefly about collection development, and if you're at an institution where this is up for discussion, it's a really important one to have, as many institutions are currently doing, and something that can potentially and hopefully change the way that people interact with collections. Even though there has been a focus on digital collection and preservation, when it is the only option for creation and development, it presents both a challenge and an exciting opportunity to have a change of focus and reevaluate how collecting, the tools we use to collect and that we feel comfortable with, how those things can change and how we can redefine some of those practices when we've perhaps maybe become too comfortable with what we are most familiar with. Collaboration is built into the structure at the AUC. There is no way around that for us. We serve 4 institutions of higher learning, so we are constantly having conversations with multiple administrations, considering multiple opinions, needs, and goals. This presents, once again, a unique and interesting opportunity. But we've also come to realize that if we don't make an effort to understand these communities of users, to promote our collections and to build these relationships, we quickly become a building with shelves full of materials that no one uses. Collection development is an area we chose to take a look at during this time to change not only how our students are interacting with our materials, but the larger community and how our community was thinking about archival collections. We wanted to know more about the majors on campus, the projects that were of interest, the needs of faculty, their research areas, as well as ensure that our collections reflected all of our students, faculty, and the larger Atlanta community where we are situated. We wanted to take a look at how the records were being created, how they were being described, and hopefully make adjustments when and where we could. So even though we're an academic institution, we are open to the public, and we like to engage our community, and we wanted to engage it more broadly to utilize the history and collections housed here. So just for some background really quickly, the AUC's collecting scope is Black American history and African diasporic history. So that is a very large umbrella. We collect the history of the institutions we serve and have several strong collecting areas underneath that umbrella, including higher education, civil rights, religion, Black organizations. We also have a large rare books collection. And our collections range from those of the papers of Martin Luther King Jr. to Black politicians in Atlanta to the presidents of the universities we serve. But as I was doing this initial assessment, it also quickly became clear that there were gaps within that collecting scope, areas and collections of study that were not necessarily represented within our extensive records. So then my next question became, where are these gaps? What does our community need? In this case, we serve 4 academic institutions. So there's a variety of programs and majors that are occurring at our schools, and how can we be better supportive of that? How is the narrative of history within our scope being told, and what are those ways in which we can expound on that? So I also wanted to focus on how we are addressing those needs. So we're going to get into the specifics of how we address collecting COVID-19 records as an example later on in the presentation. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit more broadly about some concepts we hope to develop as we move into this new way of thinking about records and collections. Next slide. This brings me to some very, very general steps that might be options at your institution, but were things that were definitely helpful as we were working through this process. And that is, after an initial assessment of our collections, then when possible, we did reach out to colleagues, faculty, students, community members, and investigate the needs of our users. So we consider this to be an ongoing process and something that we hope to develop more. It is oftentimes the job of one or perhaps a few people in higher administration to make the decisions on behalf of the institution about what is collected. But I found that it is extremely helpful in this process to connect with others, develop a selection partner or team with a variety of users. This could look different depending on where you are, but for us, it was ensuring that I wasn't making decisions in a vacuum as the head of the department, but rather a group of people were looking at these areas and discussing what the archive needed, how best to collect them or not to collect them, and what exactly can community partners look like. At first, it was library staff, and then we moved those conversations to work more directly with faculty and students in instruction and public services. And then we had conversations directly with some community members as well. The next step for us is to hopefully create an advisory council made up of faculty, students, and community to engage in new strategic areas of collection development. So this, all of this work led us to narrowing down to 5 main, what I'm calling proactive collection development, right? So to be passive in the process of preserving collections and waiting until we hear from donors means that we might not be able to meet the needs of our community, especially now when needs are changing so rapidly from both online and in person to almost exclusively online. Working almost entirely from home, our community of users might not realize we exist at all, or that were interested in having their records as part of the archival collection. This is where our proactive approach to collection development came into play. This wasn't a strategy to go out and collect as much as we can, as quickly as we can, but rather an opportunity to build relationships with different groups of people and organizations that either didn't realize we exist or that the archive was a place for them, and then to make the donation of those records as easy and as user-friendly as possible. It means going to events, virtual events in this case, sharing resources, and changing the narrative of how we are perceived, having direct conversations with outside organizations and individuals to ensure that we are building a system of trust and honesty. This often also means stepping outside of our profession and seeking partners in other areas of expertise. And sometimes that's uncomfortable for us, but I found it to be very beneficial. So having one-on-one conversations with students, potential donors, but also people who are working in different professional areas, museum curation, education, activism, grassroots organization, those type of things, to help reframe the way that we think about collection development. Where we hope this leads is more direct community involvement in a town hall fashion, directly visiting classrooms more often, and working with these partners on grants. Okay, next slide. So after doing the initial assessment for our collections, we narrowed down 5 main collecting areas that we did want to be proactive in. So going out and establishing these relationships, finding these records, seeing if they belonged in the archive and if it was the best place for them. Our 5 main areas of collection development are women, LGBTQ communities, particularly the history of the organizations on our campuses through oral histories, performing and visual arts, Black speculative fiction, and Southern hip hop. So Southern hip hop and LGBTQ organizations in particular were areas where the models of community involvement came into play. We have to be familiar with both the academic research around these communities as well as the key members and what is going on and happening even beyond traditional academia. It's important to know how the communities work and if this kind of record keeping would even be helpful to those members. So before any collecting began, it's important to have these initial conversations, attend community meetings and organizational meetings just to get a feel for how the group is working and functioning and if a partnership is mutually beneficial. Additionally, there may be some cases where the records don't need to be at an institutional archive. In those cases, we're going to talk a little bit more about exploring participatory archives. And it also might be the case where simply sharing information on caring and preserving collections within that specific community might be the best way to build that partnership. Then there are conversations that happen because donors don't think their collections would be welcome in an archive. And this is where we hope to change that narrative. So we are offering new perspectives on what it means to collect, preserve, and provide access to collections. And that means as many aspects of history as possible, not just the most visible or what has been considered traditional. So pop culture in this case is extremely important in how our students and users create new works. So we wanted to go beyond just traditional academia and presidential administration records and explore the means in which the history of our institutions change and move and what makes and affects that change. So we, pre-COVID, were inviting artists, musicians, and student groups just to come to the archive in an almost one-on-one basis to explore what exactly the archive was. And the most common questions we received was, yeah, this is great, but what would I put in an archive? What does it mean that I, a musician, have an archival collection? I'm still creating music and you see my finished product. So what exactly does an archival collection look like for me? We wanted to do more than just physically talk about that. We wanted to demonstrate it. So we went out and had discussions with actual artists and musicians at our schools and in Atlanta to talk about what creating an archival collection looked like. So some of the results are what you see on the slide. So Fahamu Piku is a local Atlanta artist, but he's internationally known, and he donated sketchbooks, some behind the scenes work, financial information, early drafts, show ephemera, and those kinds of things to give sort of a behind the scenes look at what it takes for an artist to produce a show. Dawood Anabwile is a comic book artist, and he and his brother created an independent comic book called Brother Man. And he donated not only his drafts of the comic book, but mixtapes that they had made while they were creating the comic book. So the tapes are meant to be played while you're reading through the comic book, and this will give a unique experience to their work. And we've also taken into consideration performing arts. So Aku Kadogo is a professor at Spelman College, and she was also a choreographer and a writer and a actor herself. And she donated her workbooks, photographs, original scripts, and notes in coming up with her plays. So it's these kinds of materials that are meant to bring a more direct connection to students and their work, and how hopefully, like I said, we can change sort of the common accepted narrative of what is in an archive and what could be in an archive. Next slide. Being able to respond quickly to the needs of the community and to the events happening in real time has not always been a strong suit of the academic archive. One way to really increase active engagement with your community is to develop easy to use ways of gathering stories and materials in real time. This is made a lot easier with dealing with digital content in some ways, especially during the pandemic when we can't meet with donors and students directly. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But before we got into that, I wanted to also talk about embracing new methods and ways of thinking in terms of collecting and collaborating with archival collections. So Project Stand is an example of a collaborative project that is working to make resources of academic institutions more accessible by co-locating resources on documenting student activism in one centralized place. The idea behind this is that Project Stand doesn't belong to one institution in particular, but rather is made up of many partner institutions that provide a clearinghouse for those specifically dealing with student activism to find resources. Project Stand is focused on enhancing access to documentation of student groups that represent the concerns of historically marginalized communities, and is made up of over 50 partners. It provides an archive and student activism toolkit, a digital library, resources to help both institutions and student activist groups, and intentionally provides a way for more documentation to happen on students' own terms. So it's not necessarily telling you that you need to donate to an institution, but rather providing you with resources to know what's the best decision for you and your organization. We're going to get into a little bit more detail about those easy to use methods and what we did for COVID, but in other ways institutions are engaging in different methods of collecting is important to recognize, and we are a partner with Project Stand, and this is a more communal approach based in information and resource sharing rather than institutional ownership. Project Stand provides this place to find resources and hopefully delve into the more ethical issues surrounding documenting both students and activism records in general. So this keeps the conversation open to a variety of perspectives and keeps one person from solely making all the decisions about what is kept, how it is preserved, and even the language used to preserve it. It's meant to be a place of frank discussion about the trust between institutions and student activists and how to be better partners going forward. So this is just one example of something that the AUC is involved in around student activism in particular, but I'm very interested in ways that we can develop something similar for other types of communities as well. Next slide. So beyond, once again, beyond thinking of passive collection development and ownership at an institutional level, there's also the idea of participatory archives. There are other methods of collecting community history than simply acquiring physical materials. Physically keeping and collecting materials in one location is no longer the only option. And as we'll see with our COVID-19 collection, having digital files submitted to one institution does not necessarily negate the idea that they can be used in other ways by the creator going forward, right? So just because you donate your materials to an archive doesn't mean that those materials are exclusively now just in one place and only one place. This digital options gives this term what we consider to be ownership just much more flexibility. With more and more content being created uniquely in our digital environment, our methods of collecting and interpreting that collection can change as well. If we redefine how we think of ownership, we open up the possibility of preserving a much wider range of historical narrative in partnership with donors rather than as gatekeepers of materials. It is our goal to go beyond good intentions to explore how archivists might partner with the public to repurpose the archive as a site of social transformation and radical inclusion. It's important to acknowledge that archives and knowledge are not inherently accessible to all, just because you say that you're open to the public. That doesn't necessarily remove the barriers of access or mean that the collections you have are representative of your established user group. So how do we engage with the archives and institutions that are already created, and what can we do to go outside of that established structure? For the AUC, we are working towards this, and we consider ourselves a yes and this is a phrase that Walida Imarisha discussed in her SAA keynote in 2017, and that is to say, yes, we are an academic archive and we do collect and preserve materials, and we are also working with the community, discussing what types of collections our patrons need, often physically going out into different communities and using our skill sets and resources to partner with different kinds of collective histories. So what's on the screen, the Pittsburgh community is a historic community in Atlanta. Atlanta, if you don't know, is experiencing a lot of gentrification in its historically Black neighborhoods particularly. And the Pittsburgh collective came to us and was very interested in collecting the history of their community, but keeping it in the community itself. And so rather than knowing that we were going to go into Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh community, collect materials and bring them back to the archive, we went into the community as partners and we taught workshops and met in community centers and held sort of informational sessions with the goal that preservation and historical preservation in your neighborhood doesn't necessarily mean it ends up in your personal archive as well. And we're interested in exploring that in more detail in other ways that we can partner going forward. Now we are going to move into how we began this process in terms of COVID-19 materials in particular, and how we're doing more responsive real-time collection development with COVID-19 and web content.
Hello there. Thank you, Sarah. Just going to build on what Sarah said and go into some concrete examples, starting with our COVID-19 project. This project grew out of a discussion that started with Sarah and Christine thinking about the importance of collecting real-time responses rather than waiting 10 or 15 years to get collecting on a particular historical event. Like many of our current events, much of the content being created is digital and is often ephemeral in nature. And we, considering that the moment was of historic significance, we wanted to capture the initial impressions of the AUC community while the schools were closing and staff and students were being sent home. How did this change the trajectory of the term and the experience of graduation? Where would students live? And what resources were being made available for students and faculty and community members? We knew that we were going to be able to collect the official administrative response from the schools, but what we wanted to collect and document was the, for example, the sophomore who just lost their internship, or how senior classes pulled together to celebrate graduation from a distance, even though they couldn't be together. We had also heard that Georgia State University was already doing something similar, and we knew we needed to develop a way to quickly set up and gather these responses and get administrative approval so that we could get them online. Sarah and Christine both conducted research on this topic, and Sarah wrote up a proposal for admin and also brought it to the Digital Preservation Working Group. And that's a collaborative interdepartmental group made up of digital services staff, research librarians, and archives research center staff. This allowed us to, I think, get more out of the silo and be able to pull this together. So DSD and ARC worked together to create a submission form in SurveyMonkey that gathered metadata and in most cases actual submissions of material. The form included fields for name and contact info, school affiliation, confirmation of appropriate age for donation, and a field to submit the person's narrative. The submitter was also required to agree to the donor agreement, which was in the form. Photos or documents could also be attached to the survey, or larger files and longer narratives could be uploaded to a Google Drive space that we monitored to pull those submissions in. We worked with the communication department to create informational guides that could be distributed on social media and through email and on the library website. The communication department worked with all of the AUC schools to spread the word through the AUCC Communication Task Force, and we promoted the collection on social media. We worked directly with faculty, sending out emails and making phone calls to members of the community that we thought might be interested. We developed assignments faculty could use, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the later slide. One of the things that we found was that people, students and faculty loved the idea of donating these stories, but it was difficult to get the follow through all the time. Finally, we also created an interdepartmental review committee to go through the submissions to check for appropriateness, say from length or materials. And this committee met weekly for about a month, reviewing all the submissions and making recommendations. So you can see here the landing page for the collection. We launched this within a few weeks of starting the collection. Through the online form, we received 24 submissions from members of the community, i.e. students and faculty for the most part. And we also solicited submissions from library staff, and these were sent directly to DSD for upload to the collection. In the end, the committee approved 18 objects for upload. Really, we didn't outright reject very many submissions, but some of them might be very short. We found that some people treated it more as a survey rather than as a collection tool, since it was, which makes sense, since this was made in SurveyMonkey. So that's somewhat to be expected. Okay, so just for examples of a few of the things that we collected. You can see on the left a smaller version of the collage you saw earlier of library workspaces. To the right of that, you can also see a flyer, an example of a virtual meetup of the AUC students, so that they could really deal with this rapidly changing environment. We also took pictures of the empty library, and we have narratives of people's experience or their reactions, as well as newsletters from organizations, such as over on the right-hand side, an ITC newsletter that was donated that talks about COVID-19 response. DSD got in on the act. You can see yours truly holding forth about my experience at the time. This is several months ago now, so maybe it's time to do part 2 of this video, but Zoom allowed us all to meet together and to talk to whatever extent we were comfortable about our experience and what it was like to be going through this very odd time in our institutional history. So the project outcomes, initially in the first few weeks, as I mentioned, we had quite a few submissions, and the committee reviewed all of those and made final decisions and created a new collection in our institutional repository, which is also known as RADAR. This collection included the best of the submission, as well as submissions from library staff and gathering of smaller submissions into word collages. Overall, this project provided a good opportunity for community outreach, as well as documenting our community's more ephemeral responses to the COVID-19 crisis. It's especially important to document the experiences of students and community members at HBCUs, as these institutions are often not as robustly documented during these historical periods. What we found is that while we had an initial surge of submissions, the end of the spring semester saw a sudden end to that, and we also found that the students and faculty often just thought of this as a survey of us trying to get their very brief opinion. So we definitely need to continue our communications and outreach efforts around this collecting area. especially now that we're in a new semester and as we go forward as this crisis continues to be a part of our lives. So we do have future plans for that project to continue. As I mentioned, we'll have a new round of promotion amongst members of the AUC community, and also hopefully in the West Side neighborhoods where the colleges are located. We're also collaborating with faculty to create assignments. For example, the Archives Research Center has developed some ideas for assignments, including for one example, an oral history assignment, where students interview a fellow student, a friend, or a family member and record that interview for inclusion in the archives. Questions could include what changes have you personally experienced, whether those are physical or emotional. What changes have you observed in your family, your friends, or your local community? Are you practicing social distancing? Are you wearing a mask? How has your life changed in that regard? Or even what do you think about the actions of local or national government leaders in response to this crisis? So the archives has created a list of questions in addition to those that will allow students to look at all kinds of aspects of this historical event. So let's go. So another thing that we wanted to do is leverage our existing Archive-It subscription. We were already collecting materials from the institutions, such as websites and social media presence. But we also wanted to create a collection around COVID-19 resources. And we met as part of our committee and digital preservation working group to discuss the feeds that we might crawl. Examples included Twitter feeds of the Atlanta Mayor's Office or following specific hashtags about HBCUs and COVID-19. We also wanted to capture local news stories with specific relation to our community. These could include stories from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, local African-American owned newspapers, or media from the AUC schools. As you can see here, this is a screenshot of one of our early crawls where we gathered 1.4 gigabytes of information, which isn't a huge amount. We're continuing to test and try new seeds, but you have to be really careful, as we found the recent test crawl of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's coronavirus coverage alone timed out with over 40 gigabytes of information. So that's another lesson learned. And of course, while we were already having to adjust to what was going on with COVID-19 and closure of the schools and staying at home, we also witnessed the killing of George Floyd by police and also other ongoing racial injustices in our society, sparking intensified protests and movements for racial justice. Here in Atlanta, we also had Rayshard Brooks being killed by police, and the reactions to that. So we had these two huge historic events going on at the same time. So what we did here is we created a spreadsheet for staff from different departments to submit suggestions for seeds to crawl, and started test crawling those seeds to add them into the collection. Again, early on, you could see here that we were able to gather very quickly 4 gigabytes of information, and there's still more to find. But this gives us another avenue where we can get out there and find information that we might not have collected for many years afterwards in the past. So, and that we've also realized that over the last couple of years that web archiving can be used as a collecting tool. It's a great tool for outreach to potential donors, not just a collecting tool in regard to crawling websites and social media. It can also be used as a perk offered to local individuals and groups, or another aspect of collecting. For some groups, a web presence may account for the vast majority of the material, so it's important that we use archive it as a way to make sure we capture those. This is particularly true for student and youth-led organizations. So just want to close talking about some of the lessons learned. And as I mentioned before, continued outreach, continued marketing of our collecting initiatives is a key aspect here. If you just put it out there and just let it sit there, no one's going to notice it. So we have to be proactive in that. We also know that it's difficult to get submissions outside of academic terms. So we probably need to really think about how to ramp up during those times. Working directly with faculty to increase engagement, as in the assignment that was created by the Archives Research Center. And also just making the submission process as easy and as clear as possible so that people don't have to jump through a lot of hoops to make sure that we get their materials. So our future plans, and we will engage in that outreach and marketing of our COVID-19 collection efforts, as well as also, you know, we can do other outreach for other collection efforts. Expand the crawling of our local news and information sources, and think about maybe other social media platforms that we should be going on, such as Instagram or more Twitter feeds, Facebook pages of groups. Embed our archival collecting efforts in our archival instruction sessions, as well as the ideas for assignments, and continue to explore new methods and models of collection development and participatory archives. So with that, I'll close and invite you to contact us with any questions or comments or suggestions that may have come out of this talk. Thank you very much.